If a janitor stepped up to the board and solved a problem the teacher called impossible, would you believe it was a miracle or just a truth no one ever dared to face? A condescending glance, a cold remark, math isn't for people who mop floors. But when Elijah Hart, the man in a maintenance uniform, picked up the chalk and wrote the first line, the entire class fell silent. And you, if you had witnessed that moment, whose side would you be on? If you believe intelligence doesn't wear a uniform, drop a comment below. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because this story might just change the way you see people. Forever. Now, let me tell you the truth about the man who silenced an entire school with a single equation. Elijah Hart was the maintenance man at Ashwood Hill Academy, a quiet figure, pushing his tool cart through tiled hallways where students passed him like he was part of the wall. Few knew that when his shift ended, Elijah returned to a small apartment at Brightmoor Flats, where he cared for his 16-year-old daughter, Aurora Hastings, with the quiet love of a man who hadn't truly slept since his wife passed from cancer 3 years ago. Their dinners were often cold pancakes, but they always came with soft laughter and math problems turned into games, a private ritual between father and daughter. The past still clung to him, memories of the day he walked away from ArcLight Institute of Science, where he'd once been the rising star of the Applied Mathematics Department. He left it all behind, scholarships, research offers, to care for his mother after a stroke. Just 1 year, he told himself. But 1 year became 10. Now to the world, he was just the man who mopped floors, but in his mind, numbers were still the only place where life made perfect sense. So when Elijah happened to witness Rowan Devereux, a student with chronic back pain, being forced into a stiff chair while pleading to stand, he clenched his broom handle so hard it snapped. And when Mason Whitaker, the arrogant math teacher, scoffed at Elijah for pausing in front of the equation on the board and sneered, "Math isn't for janitors," Elijah said nothing. But that night back home, he quietly solved the problem. Not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to hold on to the part of himself the world had long forgotten. Beneath the quiet exterior, Elijah had once been a math prodigy at the ArcLight Institute of Science, where equations weren't just numbers, they were life itself. He had been Professor Wesley Hawthorne's most promising student, once expected to become a groundbreaking researcher in nonlinear systems. But fate had other plans. First came his mother's stroke, then cancer took his wife. And just like that, Elijah was left to carry life alone, raising his daughter Aurora in an apartment barely bright enough to hold a single hope. He packed away his dreams in a cardboard box filled with notebooks, scribbled in formulas, and put on the maintenance uniform of Ashwood Hill Academy, a place where intellect slept beneath the sound of brooms brushing hallway floors. Then came Mason Whitaker, the walking emblem of everything Elijah had once let go. Tweed jackets, polished degrees, a voice that lectured more than it taught. Whitaker didn't explain math. He dictated it. His lessons weren't about learning, they were about fear. One day, Elijah stood at the door of classroom 3B, just to empty the trash, when he heard Whitaker snap, "If you can't solve it, don't waste whiteboard space." Ivy Carrington, a quiet student, lowered her head and returned to her seat, eyes red with shame. Elijah stepped in to grab the bin. Whitaker glanced at him and smirked. "You wouldn't get it either." Math isn't for janitors. The class burst into laughter. Elijah said nothing, just lowered his gaze and wheeled his cart away. But that night, instead of eating dinner right away, he sat down at the kitchen table, redrew the equation from memory, and solved it, in silence, under warm yellow light. With the heart of a man who had never stopped loving mathematics, even when the world had long forgotten he ever belonged to it. Mason Whitaker, the calculus teacher at Ashwood Hill Academy, never bothered to hide his disdain for Elijah. To him, anything that didn't come with accolades or academic credentials was beneath notice. Just noise, or worse, trash. "You don't belong here." That's what he once told Elijah during a parent-teacher meeting, after catching him helping his daughter study in the hallway. And maybe Elijah believed it too. Until one winter afternoon, when he stumbled upon Rowan Devereux, a student with chronic back pain who was often scolded for not sitting properly, crying alone in Polaris Hall, the school's old library. "I don't get it," Rowan whispered, his voice trembling. I'm scared to go back to class. Elijah sat beside him, pulled out a scrap of paper, and began to draw. Not equations, not definitions. Just shapes, basketball arcs, racetracks, puzzle pieces. And for the first time, Rowan smiled in the middle of an integral problem. Rumors started to spread. A janitor who could teach math. A week later, Ivy Carrington, top of the class, the same student who had once cried after being humiliated by a teacher, quietly came to find Elijah. Then 3 more students followed. They began meeting every Friday evening after school in a quiet corner of Polaris Hall. No blackboard, just pencils, sketch paper, and a man with the kind of patience that didn't feel real. Their test scores soared. No more confusion, no more panic. The kids who once feared math started asking for more. And when Ivy told her classmates, he doesn't stand at the front of a classroom, but he's the best teacher I've ever had, something shifted, not just in that room, but in the way people began to understand the true measure of a human being. In one particular class, Rowan Devereaux, struggling again with back pain, stood frozen at the whiteboard, staring helplessly at a differential equation the entire class had already given up on. His eyes kept drifting toward the back of the room, where Elijah Hart was quietly emptying a trash bin in the corner. Seeing Rowan paralyzed in front of the board, Mason Whitaker smirked. Planning to stand there till the bell rings? Or should we ask the janitor to solve it for you? The class burst out laughing, but Rowan didn't, and for the first time, Elijah didn't walk away. Could I just ask Mr. Hart for a minute? Rowan said softly. No one breathed. Whitaker chuckled. Perfect. Math Street Theater. Be my guest. Elijah hesitated, but when he saw Rowan bracing his aching back, something shifted. He nodded and stepped toward the board. The marker trembled slightly in his hand. The problem was a high-level system of differential equations, something typically seen in postgraduate studies. He began to write. No flair, no dramatic flair or polished presentation, but every step flowed with quiet precision. Variable substitution, reverse derivation, Laplace transformations. A silent rhythm pulsed across the whiteboard as Elijah walked them through it, until finally he wrote the last line. Silence. Whitaker stepped forward to examine the work, frowning. His eyes paused on one substitution, a move none of the students had ever been taught. This is an unorthodox method, he muttered. But it's right, a student spoke up. And it made more sense than yours, Ivy Carrington added quietly. But her words cracked through the silence like thunder. The next day, the entire school was buzzing. The unsolvable problem had been conquered by the janitor. Elijah became the talk of every hallway, and that was when he was summoned to the principal's office. Not for praise, but because someone had raised a red flag. The class was stunned. As Elijah Hart stepped down from the temporary podium, a strange hush swept over the room. The students no longer looked at him like the man who mopped the floors, but like a teacher who had just awakened something inside them. Rowan whispered, I've never seen math look so beautiful. Even Ivy Carrington, the girl who used to hate math, turned to her friend and murmured, when he explained it, I didn't just understand it with my brain, I felt it. But as the room erupted in applause, Mason Whitaker gripped his dry erase marker so tightly his knuckles went white. That's enough, he said flatly. This is a math class, not a circus act. Days later, rumors spread through the hallways. Students began lining up outside Polaris Hall Library after school, where Elijah quietly tutored those who had long been labeled slow learners or hopeless cases. The classroom atmosphere began to shift. Suddenly, test scores started rising, high enough to draw attention. Then everything exploded. 5 students, including Rowan and Ivy, scored perfect marks on Whitaker's advanced differential exam. Enraged, Whitaker filed a formal complaint with the school board, accusing the group of organized cheating and naming the alleged mastermind, Elijah Hart. Elijah was summoned to the principal's office. His eyes didn't show surprise, just sadness. He had always known, when someone like him steps out of the shadows, someone else is bound to squint at the light. I didn't give them the answers, he said quietly. I only helped them see what their teacher forgot, that math is meant to be understood, not feared. A board meeting was called, and for the first time in 10 years, the full truth about Elijah Hart was about to be revealed. Not through his own words, but by someone who had once been a legend in the world of mathematics. News spread through the school like wildfire. The janitor solved the impossible equation. Elijah Hart, the name once buried in the janitorial roster, was now whispered in hallways, praised after class, and met with eyes of quiet admiration from students who used to pass him like he was invisible. But not everyone was pleased. Inside the boardroom, Mason Whitaker slammed a stack of test papers onto the table. 5 students, perfect scores, same class, same solving method. Something doesn't add up. Principal Evelyn Blackwood stayed silent. She had heard the rumors. She had watched. And now it was time for the truth. Elijah was called in. In that room, where truth had nowhere left to hide, he didn't deny and he didn't defend. He simply pulled out a worn notebook, the cover frayed, the pages yellowed with time. On the first page was a handwritten note from a teacher, Wesley Hawthorne, to Elijah. Never let your genius be defined by the title someone else gives you. The room went still. Elijah lifted his head and spoke calmly. I didn't teach them to cheat. I taught them to believe they weren't stupid, just never truly listened to. 1 minute later, a private phone call was made. 3 days after that, Wesley Hawthorne himself, a renowned academic and mentor to some of the brightest minds in mathematics, unexpectedly arrived at Havencrest Academy. At a full school assembly, he stepped up to the podium, his voice steady and commanding. If you've ever asked me who my greatest student was, it's the man who mopped your floors for 10 years. And not one of you ever asked, who did he used to be? Elijah began quietly tutoring students in Polaris Hall, teaching math in a way that was simple, intuitive, and unexpectedly inspiring. Kids who once kept their heads down in shame now raised their hands with confidence. The whiteboard filled with scribbles. Every chair was taken, and test scores, once scraping the bottom, began to climb to heights no one, not even the teachers, thought possible. But then, something no one saw coming happened. Mason Whitaker, furious over the sudden improvement of his 11th grade students, demanded a public challenge exam. 5 college-level problems were written across the giant board in the main auditorium, witnessed by the school board, the entire student body, and even local reporters with cameras rolling. Elijah entered. No name tag, no title, just a stick of chalk, and the mop he had leaned quietly by the door. Whitaker faced him, his voice sharp with challenge. If you've really been teaching, prove it. A full minute passed. Elijah set down the rag, removed his gloves, and stepped forward. He didn't look at the crowd, only at the numbers on the board, as if greeting an old friend. Problem 1, 3 lines. Problem 2, 6 steps. Problem 3, labeled unsolvable, he solved with a visual diagram that made the room erupt. Problem 4 was taken from the very university exam he once received a full scholarship for. Then came the final problem. Elijah paused. He turned to the students and asked, would any of you like to try this one? Rowan, the boy with the aching back, once ridiculed, rose to his feet. His hands trembled, but his eyes burned with fire. Elijah nodded and stepped aside. The entire auditorium held its breath. And in that moment, Elijah wasn't the janitor. He was the guide. The results were in. The students who had once ranked at the very bottom were now scoring unusually high. Whitaker was furious. He accused them of cheating and demanded a formal investigation. Elijah said nothing. He simply stood beside his students, his eyes not angry, just heavy with a quiet sadness, as if he'd always known this day would come. An emergency meeting was called. In the faculty room, Whitaker slammed the files onto the table. This is impossible. Those kids used to be the lowest in the class. There's no way they suddenly got smart, unless someone was coaching them in secret. Principal Bennett, a man who had long trusted the system, now found himself at a loss. He asked Elijah to submit a written statement. Elijah handed over a single sheet of paper, but it wasn't a defense. It was a math problem. And beneath the solution was a mark, a distinct academic symbol, known only to scholars trained at the ArcLight Institute of Science. Bennett froze. He flipped through archived records, dusty files of former students lost in the national system, then looked up at Elijah. Moments later, he called the school library and requested the yearbook, 15 years old, forgotten in storage. Page 42. A photo, Professor Wesley Hawthorne, world-renowned mathematician, his hand on the shoulder of his brightest protege, Elijah Hart. The room fell silent. A man they never thought to ask about. A genius who once won gold at the International Mathematics Olympiad, now mopping floors, wringing rags, and cleaning bathrooms. We let him disappear from education, just because he didn't wear a white button-down. And in that moment, the loudest voice in the room was the first to bow his head. Elijah openly admitted he had helped the students, but never once revealed who he truly was. He didn't want credit. He only wanted them to understand. The boardroom went silent. Elijah didn't defend himself. He didn't plead. He just said one thing, and it made everyone lower their heads in quiet reflection. I had a mother who couldn't read, a wife who studied by candlelight because we couldn't afford tuition. I can't watch another child break under the weight of a problem when no one's there to help. Principal Bennett sat in silence for a long time, then rose to his feet. He walked over to Elijah and extended his hand. You don't need a title to be a teacher, but if you're willing, Polaris Hall needs you, officially. From that day forward, Elijah became both the school's maintenance worker and its first officially recognized mentor without a formal teaching license. Granted the rare distinction of teaching from the heart, not the chalk. And Whitaker? One afternoon, he quietly stepped into his classroom with different eyes. He no longer lectured like a commander. He started asking students, "What do you think?" The same words Elijah always used. And then, on a rainy afternoon, Whitaker happened to see Elijah mopping the hallway floors. He hesitated, walked over, and handed him a book. "Mr. Hart, I want to learn more about linear algebra. Would you be willing to teach me?" Elijah looked up and smiled gently. No one noticed, but his eyes glistened, just slightly. Not for himself, but for all the things he thought he had lost, now quietly being rebuilt, through the change in someone else. The public showdown was held at Ashwood Commons, where Elijah would solve 5 advanced problems in front of the entire school, to prove once and for all what he was capable of. The auditorium was packed. On one side sat the students who had once been dismissed, their fingers gripping exams marked with perfect scores. On the other were board members, teachers, and even parents who had once demanded their children be removed from school for lacking the ability to learn math. And at the center stood Elijah. No crisp dress shirt, no calculator, no notes. Just a dry erase marker and steady eyes. The problems appeared on the screen behind him, Olympiad-level questions that had once left even faculty stumped. Elijah stepped to the board. He wrote the first line. The entire room was so silent you could hear someone breathe. Problem 1, done in 3 minutes. Problem 2, 5. By the third, the judges stood, stunned, as Elijah bypassed the standard approach, with a shortcut no textbook had ever published. And when he completed the final line of the 5th problem, applause erupted, not because someone called for it, not because it was expected, but because no one could stay seated. Principal Bennett's voice shook as he stepped forward. We were wrong. Not just for misjudging a man, but for letting our own prejudice blind us for far too long. And from the back row, a girl who had once failed math twice stood up, her voice breaking through tears. Mr. Hart is the one who made me believe in myself. I never even dreamed I'd qualify for the state competition. That moment was no longer a confrontation. It was the day Ashwood Hill rewrote what it meant to truly see the janitor. With calm focus and quiet brilliance, Elijah solved all 5 problems, including the one designed by Whitaker himself, using methods so simple, so elegant, no one saw them coming. The whiteboard slowly filled with symbols. But what stunned the crowd wasn't just the answers. It was how he solved them, gently, without theatrics, each step etched like it came from a mind that had lived and breathed mathematics for a lifetime. Then came the 5th problem, the one Whitaker had once used to test the competence of new faculty. Elijah took exactly 6 minutes, No calculator, no diagrams. He simply smiled and wrote 3 lines. So minimal, many thought he was wrong. But then a professor from the front row suddenly rose and began clapping. "That's the arc light classic method," he said. "A technique believed lost for over 20 years. Only a few of Hawthorne's students ever learned it." The room fell into stunned silence. Whitaker stood frozen, his expression hollow, as he recalled the harsh words he once tossed at a curious janitor. Elijah said nothing. He bowed his head and quietly began erasing the board, just like he did every other day. And yet, in that moment, something shifted across the entire school. A teacher walked over and shook his hand. A student who had failed math 3 times whispered, "I get it now. Not because you're brilliant, but because you believed we could be." And Mason Whitaker, the one who had once looked down on him the most, was the first to stand and the last to stop clapping. Principal Serafina Wilde, known for her strict fairness and unwavering standards, quietly ordered a background check on Elijah after the explosive showdown at Ashwood Commons. But what she discovered was beyond anything she could have imagined. Archived records from the Arclight Institute were unsealed for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Elijah Hart's name didn't just appear, it led the list. Top of his class, personal mentee of the esteemed Wesley Hawthorne, recipient of the most prestigious scholarship from the Institute of Applied Mathematical Sciences, before he mysteriously vanished from academia without explanation. In her small office, Serafina stared at an old photograph. A young Elijah, eyes bright with promise, standing among the most brilliant minds of his generation. Attached was a handwritten fax from Hawthorne himself. "Elijah wasn't the best student I ever taught. He was the only one who could understand the way I think." She slowly set the paper down, remembering Elijah's unwavering gaze during the public challenge. Not there to prove himself, but to protect the students who had once been forgotten. That evening, Serafina quietly entered Polaris Hall and sat at the back of the room. Elijah was teaching a group of struggling students. No smartboards, no flashy curriculum. Just a plain whiteboard, a few sticks of chalk, and the focused, glowing eyes of children who finally believed they could learn. Elijah didn't know anyone was watching, but the principal saw everything she needed to. And in that quiet moment, one truth became crystal clear. When a man who once stood at the peak chooses to return in silence, he doesn't need a title to be honored. He needs to be understood. Elijah asked for nothing after the public challenge. He simply returned to the maintenance room and wiped the board clean, as if none of it had ever happened. But the school board could no longer turn away. In an emergency meeting held in Principal Serafina Wilde's office, a decision was made, quiet but monumental. Elijah Hart was officially appointed as Ashwood Hill Academy's after-school mathematics mentor. Not as a favor, but as recognition. Elijah didn't quit his maintenance job. In fact, he asked to keep it. Just as he'd once told his students, "Knowledge helps us soar, but work keeps us grounded." From that day on, Polaris Hall was never empty in the late afternoons. Struggling students slowly began to gather, not chasing grades, but seeking something rarer: to be heard, to be understood, to be taught as if they mattered. In the back of the room, Aurora, Elijah's daughter, sat quietly watching her father teach. Her eyes didn't glow from pride. They shone because, for the first time, she saw her father living the life that made him happiest, giving knowledge and receiving respect. And as a silent gesture of redemption, the school pledged to fully fund Elijah's return to the teaching certification program he left behind a decade ago. A gift, or perhaps an apology. For all the years they overlooked a man with brilliance in his mind, simply because he wore gray and pushed a cart in silence. Whitaker didn't show up to the first tutoring session, but by the third he stood outside the door, silent, watching. Instead of a whiteboard filled with dense equations, Elijah used folded paper models, shapes, and even math games to illuminate concepts that once felt impossible. Every question was met with full attention, every mistake treated with patience. No sighs, no furrowed brows. The next day, Whitaker returned. This time, he stepped into the room and took a seat in the back row. He didn't speak. He simply took notes, like a student starting over. Then on a rare rainy afternoon in Ashwood, with Aurora absent, Elijah quietly set his chalk down and looked over at Whitaker. Today's class could use another teacher. The room paused, but Whitaker stood up, not as the strict educator who once snapped over a misplaced comma, but as a man who now asked questions and waited for answers, who made mistakes and smiled with his students. He had begun again. From that day forward, the after-school class had two teachers, two approaches, but one heart, for the kids who had once believed they weren't good enough. And in a quiet corner of the hallway, Serafina Wilde glanced through the glass and smiled. Education doesn't need someone to win, it just needs someone willing to step down, so others can rise. Elijah wasn't just a teacher, he was a spark. When the school's new math team was formed, no one expected much, especially not from a group of so-called average students who had long been pushed out of every leaderboard and honor roll. At the core were three names that had once gone unnoticed at the back of the class. Aurora, the quiet girl who memorized formulas by feeling them. Rowan Devereux, the shy boy who could only truly focus when he was allowed to draw on the board. And Ivy Carrington, the student other teachers had once labeled a lost cause. For the first time in his life, Whitaker volunteered to walk beside Elijah, not to lead, but to learn how to stand next to someone. Together they shared every afternoon at Polaris Hall. One taught problem solving, the other taught how to think. They weren't just teaching math. They were teaching kids how to believe they deserved to solve math. One day Ivy wanted to quit, after being mocked by students from another school. Elijah reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper, and handed it to her. This is the first problem I solved after losing my wife. Not to win, but to keep going. You too, Ivy. Don't solve it to prove anything. Solve it to remind yourself you can keep moving forward. The state competition came. No banners, no cheering crowds. But when the final answer appeared on the screen, the auditorium erupted. Ashwood Hill had taken first place for the first time in 11 years. At Aurora Crest Hall, no one expected to see the name Ashwood Hill on the leaderboard. When it all began, they were just the kids who failed algebra from a school long considered the weakest in the district. But by the second round, the Ashwood team made the entire auditorium sit up and take notice. Aurora kept time by counting her breaths. Ivy wrote equations with both hands to save time. And Rowan? He used a custom symbol system Elijah had created just for him to break down simultaneous equations like second nature. Then came the final problem, a monster question that combined three advanced math disciplines. Everyone thought, this is where they stop. But Aurora raised her hand first. Ivy whispered the answer. Rowan stood up, walked to the board, and wrote the full solution, step by step. Perfect. The judges didn't speak. Then they clapped. Then they stood. The auditorium exploded in cheers. One student from another school burst into tears. We used to call them the Janitor team, but they just taught us what resilience really looks like. Elijah didn't step onto the stage. He stood quietly at the back of the auditorium, near the exit, hands still smudged with grease, uniform still the same maintenance gray. Whitaker walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said softly, I thought I was the one teaching, but it turns out I was the one being taught. In the final round, the entire auditorium held its breath. A mind-bending problem on implicit functions in multivariable limits had nearly every team putting down their pens. Rowan Devereux, the student once flagged as at risk of repeating the year, suddenly stood up. He didn't look at his teammates. He didn't look at the judges. He picked up a piece of chalk and walked straight to the board and began to write. Not the standard way, not the textbook way. He used a private symbol system, something only the Polaris Hall group had ever seen. A visual language Elijah had invented during those quiet evening sessions. Using scraps of paper and a faded whiteboard in an old broken computer room, the judges leaned toward one another and whispered, This isn't in any curriculum. One voice objected, Violation. That method's not part of formal instruction. And then, Whitaker, the same man who had once harshly dismissed Elijah, stood up. His voice was calm but firm. I teach this class. That method was approved by me, and I believe this is exactly what we should be encouraging. Not replication, but invention. A long pause. Then the judges nodded. At the back of the room, Elijah remained silent. He wasn't watching the board. He was watching Rowan. And in Rowan's eyes, he saw something far greater than a correct answer. He saw the light of someone who had once been labeled a failure, now standing on a stage of intellect and being defended, not by the janitor, but by the teacher who had once doubted them all. Ashwood Hill Academy took first place in the entire state, not because they solved the hardest problem the fastest, but because the judges had never seen a solution presented with such humanity. 3 students, Aurora, Rowan, and Ivy, stood on the winner's stage. In their hands, not scorecards or certificates, but a handmade teaching model, crafted from cardboard, copper wire, and scraps of paper. Scrawled across the bottom, in uneven handwriting, the Polaris method: anyone can understand math if you teach with respect. Elijah stood in the very last row. He didn't step forward. He just smiled, watching them. And for the first time in years, the man who had once cleaned bathrooms with his bare hands was called up by the state board to receive the title, Most Inspirational Educator of the Year. He almost declined, but Aurora, his daughter, reached for his hand. She whispered, "You don't have to do anything else, Dad. Just let them know it was you who taught me never to give up." Whitaker, the first person to ever mock him, was now the first to rise and clap. The entire auditorium followed, a standing ovation not just for a teacher, but for a man who had spent 10 silent years keeping the halls clean and quietly lighting up the future of children, with nothing more than chalk and belief. 1 year after their state championship victory, a new bronze plaque was mounted in the heart of town. Right outside a sleek, glass-walled building filled with light and floating mathematical models suspended from the tall ceiling. Whitestone Center for Logic and Discovery, in honor of Elijah Hart. No titles, no credentials, just a name. And that alone was enough for the world to know about the man who once mopped floors and quietly reshaped education with chalk, humility, and a spirit that refused to give up. The dedication ceremony was simple, no fanfare, no speeches from officials. But in the front row were the students Elijah once taught, the ones he had shown not just how to solve equations, but how to rise again after being made to feel small. Aurora, his daughter, delivered the keynote. "I used to think my father was just a janitor, but he taught me this. You don't always need to stand on a stage. Sometimes you just need the patience to help someone else stand tall." The entire auditorium rose to their feet, but Elijah wasn't there. He was in the back courtyard, erasing the whiteboard for the very first class inside the center that now bore his name. Because for him, it was never about recognition. It was about seeing the light in someone's eyes when they finally understood, the hands raised in curiosity, and the kids who once felt lost, now realizing they could find their way. Elijah Hart was awarded a full scholarship to return to ArcLight Institute, the place he once walked away from to care for his ailing mother and raise his daughter after his wife passed away. But instead of leaving Ashwood Hill behind, Elijah made a decision no one could quite believe. He kept his morning maintenance job, taught math in the afternoons, and studied at night. When asked why he didn't just move on, he simply smiled. "I once gave up a dream to keep someone I loved. Now I hold on to this job, so these kids won't have to give up theirs." At his first seminar back at ArcLight, Elijah didn't talk about mathematics. He talked about Aurora, Rowan, and Ivy Carrington, students who were once overlooked and now represent a new hope for compassionate education. He spoke of Whitaker, the man who once doubted him, who later became his co-coach for the state math team. And he spoke of the mop, still standing in the corner of the classroom, as a reminder that your origin never defines your potential. "I don't need to put down the mop to prove I'm a teacher. I just need one piece of chalk and one kid willing to learn." If you're still watching this, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever dismissed you because they couldn't see who you truly are? And what would you do if today was your moment to stand up the way Elijah Hart once did? Leave a comment below. Let me know you're here and ready to write your next chapter. And if you believe in second chances, in kindness, and in stories like this, hit subscribe because we've got so many more to share. And one of them might just be yours. A life lesson from the story of Elijah Hart, the janitor who taught the world about excellence. There are people we pass by every day, quiet, nameless, without titles, and we assume they're just part of the background in a busy world. Elijah Hart was one of those people. He pushed a janitor's cart through school hallways each day, lowered his eyes at condescending stares, stayed silent through dismissive remarks. But no one knew. Inside that worn tool pouch, Elijah carried a mind once honored at ArcLight Institute, and in his heart burned a quiet, unwavering dream: to teach, whether or not he stood at the front of a classroom. Elijah's story forces us to ask, how many Elijahs have we missed in our own lives, simply because we judge too quickly by appearances? He never asked to be recognized. He simply gave. A new way of learning to his students, a new perspective to his colleagues, and a profound lesson to his entire school about the worth of a human soul. When his students won first place in the state, no one remembered Elijah as the janitor, because by then he had become something far greater, the very definition of what it means to be a teacher. And the lesson he leaves us is as clear as any equation on a board. Never judge someone by the job they do, because sometimes the most ordinary person might just be teaching us the most extraordinary truth.